So the Pendinas project is a community archaeology project. It's a partnership between the Royal Commission and Dyfed Archaeological Trust, or the new Heneb Dyfed Archaeology, and it's funded, I should say at the very beginning, by the Heritage Lottery Fund and by Cadw, the Welsh Government. Ignore that one. So we'll start at the very beginning with what is a hill fort. I know there are different levels of understanding here. So firstly, this is the dictionary definition, so a general term used to describe a fortification on a hilltop, the best known of which are later prehistoric examples, mainly of the Bronze Age and Iron Age date, the first millennium BC. I read that out simply because that screen is quite small and you at the back might not be able to see it. I know what you're thinking, that's not a particularly useful definition, and that's because hill forts are an incredibly diverse set of monuments. In fact, there are as many differences between hill forts as there are similarities. Nonetheless, they do have many things in common. Just to illustrate this, I've included two examples at the bottom of the screen. Maiden Castle on the left-hand side, that's one of the biggest in Britain, about 45 acres or so, 15-metre deep ditches, 3 lines thick, miles in length. That is one of the most impressive prehistoric monuments we have. On the right-hand side, we have a very impressive monument in its own right. That's Castell Henllys in northern Pembrokeshire. That is formidably defended, but you can see how they would have had different functions, different uses, but nonetheless they share a lot of similarities as well. They're probably settlements at their core. They are defensive. But more than anything, they are nodes in a much wider landscape of settlement activity. They are the central places. When I think of hill forts, I like to think of medieval castles with the market, with the town, all smushed into one. I would also like to start by trying to get out of your heads the idea of the sort of rural ideal. These are not hamlets in any way. These are dirty, smelly, busy places more than anything. The greenness is very much the modern part, I'd like to say. I'd also be remiss if I didn't say that it's a scheduled monument, so that means it's protected by law. Metal detecting has gone on at Pendinas, and that is illegal. It's also a nature reserve, so the whole leave no trace when you do visit the site is quite important. The period we're talking about is the Iron Age, broadly speaking. They do start a little bit beforehand, about 1000 BC or so, and they continue right through the Romano-British period into the post-Roman period, but their main density is certainly in the Iron Age. I know what you're thinking, 43 AD, that's a stupidly specific date for them to stop as a main. That's obviously just the start of the Roman period and the start of history simply being when people start writing stuff down, with the flick of Caesar's pen, history begins. In Wales, we have almost more hill forts than any other part in the world. Our hill forts tend to be slightly smaller, but certainly as dense as anywhere. Our main distribution is between sort of 500 and 200 AD, particularly in West Wales. And you can see that there are actually concentrations within West Wales. So the southwest has probably the most in Wales, full stop. We also have other densities, top of the Severn Valley and that sort of thing. Some of that's caused by archaeological bias. Severn Valley is very good for archaeological photography or aerial photography. So Pendinas sits above Aberystwyth in the heart of Cardigan Bay, overlooking the sea. This is it close up, and it sits in a really important place at the confluence of the Ystwyth and the Rheidol and the sea. Of course, the sea was the motorway of the day, the rivers, the A-roads, if you want to think about it, something like that. This is a place of control. You know, fort can be misleading at times. It's sort of implying that you're looking inwards, you're sheltering. In fact, again, that central place is the common theme here. This is Pendinas itself. It's an extremely impressive hill fort. It's probably the second largest in West Wales after Foel which Jessica has talked about beforehand. I have people who argue it's the first biggest, but I'd probably stick with it being the second biggest. It's quite unusual in design. So you can see Aberystwyth down. Does that give a laser clicker when you do something? No, it doesn't. Aberystwyth beneath. It's quite unusual. It's two hill forts rather than one hill fort that are joined together later in their life. The southern fort is much larger. You can see our first excavation there in the foreground. And it's another thing that makes it quite unusual are these massive terraces that are carved into those eastern slopes. They are an enormous undertaking in their own right, thousands of people hours. We're not the first people to have a pop at Pendinas. Darrell Ford had a go at it in the 1930s. He's there in the middle with a nice hat, everyone else looking like they've done a day's work, as it were. I think that's Ford again, I'm not sure, but it could be. He's in a very relaxed pose if it is him. I put this photograph in primarily because it illustrates some of the problems with people doing stuff there in the 1930s. These are two massive ditches shown in this photograph, and we have absolutely no idea where they are. So again, whilst it is useful looking back at Ford's things, it is limited somewhat. Equally, we stand on 100 years worth of innovation based on their mistakes. So it's worth saying that unless we want to be criticised too much in the future, we should probably hold off on the sort of slander, as it were. That shouldn't be there. So this is Ford's only real sin was that he never published properly. In fact, he never reported properly at all. And that's problematic, obviously. And in fact, we didn't get a report until the 1960s when the Royal Commission deposited the archive, had the archive deposited to them, and then a report was written in the 1960s. That's obviously much too late. And whilst Ford did see it, it wasn't exactly, the ideal form of reporting. He did put together a 4-stage chronology. So stage 1, they build the North Fort. Phase 2, they build the South Fort. They then rebuild the South Fort, and then they join them both together. It's worth saying there isn't much proof to say that this is absolutely the case. I would argue he didn't meet that burden of proof to say it definitively. And looking at it from a modern lens, we would probably say the South Fort is more likely to be first and the North Fort an extension. So just bear that in mind. It's quite exciting for me at this point. I don't know what slide's coming next as much as you do. There's been 2 bits of work done on the fort before we got here as Dyfed Archaeology. So first, Trussor came along and did a feasibility study. This looked at basically whether a community archaeology project is feasible. I think we can now say it was. And then later, a geophysical survey, like the ones that Jessica was doing, was done on the southern fort. I'm not going to go into that today. It's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, so I'm on the clock, as it were. This is the fort, a really nice 3D model done by the Royal Commission, the partners in this project. And we're going to use this as a bit of a navigation tool for the next bit of the talk. So this is the North Fort on the right, South Fort on the left. The Wellington Monument, which many of you will recognise, is on the top of the South Fort, as it were. Our first bit of excavation here at the Trust, not a part of the Pendinas project yet, was at the south entrance. And this is our trench, directed by Fran Murphy, who's in the audience at the back. And this bit of excavation was a community project again, but funded by Cadw, the Welsh government exclusively. Our aim was to look at where Ford had worked in the south entrance. He had done quite a lot of excavation there, particularly at the back of our trench, and then work away from it into new archaeological material and compare what we found. The idea being that, we get some new data, but also we understand the old data a bit more. This is a reconstruction of the South Fort done before we did our excavation. I'm showing it now with the hope that we come back to it at the end and sort of compare how we would do it differently today. It's a really good drawing. It's done by Toby Drive at the Royal Commission, but equally there are a few things we'd change, as it were. This was what we were working with. It's a sort of a sketch plan, I think would be fair enough. And that's what we were trying to unpick all the way through the excavation. That's how it looked by the time we got to the publication in the 1960s. This was our trench. It was a backwards L shape, as it were. Ford's trench you can actually see in the big L shape at the bottom there. So what we So we'll work south to north. So at the south of the trench, we found the revetment walls that Ford had found, very nice as well, and a huge post hole which would have been the inner gateway post, as it were, one of those big gates that you can imagine. This would have been something, again, like the entrance to a castle, if you want to sort of get that in your head. We're very pleased to find this because we weren't sure what we were going to find or where Ford stopped, as it were. And actually that will give us a really good idea with dating, when this all happened. We also found that revetment walling that Ford found. Beneath the lumpy bumps that you see today, there is actually big walls. It's not sort of sloping ramparts. This was a walled enclosure, which does make it somewhat unusual. I think the ranging rod there is in the same place in both photos, as it were, to give you a sense. It was also at this point that we realised that the photographs that Ford were taking were in the mid part of the excavation and not at the end of the excavation. So Ford kept on digging, which is fair enough. He probably brought the photographer along on the best day, not the last day, as it were, but we realised quickly that we were going to be limited in what we could actually understand within Ford's area. This is my favourite photograph that Ford ever produced, mainly because his hat is still in the photograph, but also because he's using two very small buoys as scales, stood in those enormous post holes, and if you note the fence posts which are holding up the walls, which he has undermined next to it. Again, not quite how we would do it today. As we moved away, we started to find the road that went into the fort. So a nice new bit of data. It actually turned left and right rather than going straight up the hill as we saw in that reconstruction. Rather, you are being shown the interior of the fort and working your way in more gradually, rather than that sort of straight up into the centre of the fort, as it were. And then moving north again, we found a very nice hut platform, just like the ones that Jessica was talking about earlier. Hut platforms are literally scoops carved out of the hillside. We get a lot of them in West Wales, particularly in the bigger forts. And that's mainly because our hills are particularly vertical, it must be said. But they are really nice things. And one thing that is really nice about them is it preserves things very well, because it's in the lee of the hill, you get lots of gunk on top of them, and that preserves the floor surfaces and things that would otherwise be wiped away by ploughing. This one was very nice. It had a stone-lined drain that went all the way through the middle of it, curving with the bedrock slope. The photograph on the left just shows how 3D this site was. The tent is at the top there. We all had very sore ankles at the end of this excavation, it would be fair to say. Here it is again, with the floor surface just lapping over the top of it. So this would have been completely hidden. It's worth saying we did this excavation in September. This drain started working in the final week of the excavation. It was seriously soggy on top of a Welsh hill at this point. But no, a very nice thing indeed. And the environmental remains that we will get from those floor surfaces are really, really exciting. The top of the L, as it were, was just a very narrow trial trench. This was looking just to see what was in that top one. And we weren't trying to understand it properly, but just trying to compare it with the one we saw earlier on. And basically, do they compare? No. They were quite different at the starting point. This one had many more structural remains, which is very nice to see, but also, So here, for example, you've got a big post hole in the foreground. You've got drains running through the mid-ground. This is one of the big post holes at one end. So again, chiselled into the bedrock, very well constructed. And we also fantastically had some finds. Now the Iron Age, if you're into treasure hunting, is not the time for you, it must be said. That is a big Iron Age assemblage there, those three circular things. And what they are, the one on the left is certainly a spindle whorl. This is for the spinning of yarn. The one in the middle, possibly a bead, possibly a spindle whorl. I'm not sure where we've actually got to on that yet. And the one on the right is an amber bead. And just to give you a sense of how much people are trading and moving around during this time, that the nearest good source of amber is the Baltic. This is people who are moving continents, not just countries, on quite a regular basis. We also did a little bit of geophys, The important thing to do is thank the volunteers, remembering that, of course, the community aspect of this project is as big as the archaeological research questions. These were the people who got to the end of the dreadful week of backfilling. It really was a big trench, and it took an awfully long time. The lady just next to me there is actually flying a kite, which you can't see, but I never quite understood why, but she was. This is the start of the Pendinas project as we know it today. So this is when the money was applied for on the sides of that last trench we've been looking at. And in that sort of new project, the idea was to have 2 excavations in 2023 as the centrepiece of a much wider bit of work, which Becca's going to talk about afterwards. This was the first one. It was in March. Again, you're thinking that's a daft time to do a community excavation. That's because it's a wildlife reserve, and actually we've got to avoid bird nesting season as much as anything. You can see here the tactics changed. So rather than one big trench, we've gone for lots of little trenches, and that's mainly because the archaeology here is so complicated. Basically, we were trying to find where Ford was digging. We're trying to work out where on earth we are within the archaeology as much as our main objectives. If we could pin down the ramparts in any way and actually get some dates, that would be a really good place to end up. This is Ford's plan of it. It's a good plan of an incredibly complex set of excavations over several months, as it were. That's not the slide I was expecting, but there we go. And this is Ford's trenches, and you can see what he was doing. He was finding the walls, and then he was chasing them as much as anything, which is fair enough. It would be really difficult to understand what was going on here, but you can see how difficult that might be to unpick from a starting point. This is today versus Ford's plan. Ignore the trench numbers. They'll do your head in. They do my head in. I should also say I was not involved with this bit of the excavation, and if you question me on it too much, I'll probably go a little bit white at the end. It was quite fruitful though. This is a slit trench looking at the outer rampart and the counterscarp. The ditch is in the middle of that southern fort. It was quite fruitful underneath the counterscarp, so that's a slight hump that you get the other side of the ditch. There was some sealed features which should give us some good dates on the main construction phase within the fort. This one followed Ford's trenches quite directly. Here we are going down, finding Ford's trench and then following it down on the side. And by we, I mean not me, of course. And here we've got it open. They found some very nice revetting wall in there. Hopefully those deposits again will give us a bit of a glimpse of what's going on. The final trench I'm going to talk about was greatly aided by this bush in the centre of this photograph. That bush is still there, very handily, 100 years old hawthorn bush. And actually this was the trench that yielded the best results, I think it's fair to say, and gave the most impressive bit of revetment walling. You can see there something that is quite important within this revetment walling, and that is that not all of it is quarried stone. Some of it is boulder pebbles and cobbles and that sort of thing, which of course come from the bottom of the hill. We don't really know why that is, it's fair to say. I'm sure they had a blimmin' good reason for doing it, because it would have been really hard work, but you know, it is a really interesting component of the way that they were building the fort. This is it a little bit later again. There was a big hole in the left-hand side of it. You can sort of see it on the left-hand side of my photograph there. It's Ken Murphy, the director of the dig, in said hole, drawing it. This was a bit of a puzzle. I think the consensus is at this point, I'm kind of looking for Ken at this point, is that this was a Fordian hole, if you want to think about it that way. But at the base of the hole, there was glass and there was metal. There was a big debate as to whether this is medieval or modern glass. I think we're settling towards modern is my understanding, but it's been a bit of a journey with that one. This is where we got OLS dating on sighting. This is pretty niche even by archaeological standards. So this is optical luminescence spectroscopy. And this is where you date the last time that the quartz grains within the rock or the silt that you want to look at was exposed to sunlight. It's an amazing thing and a capability we have thanks to the specialists at Aberystwyth University. And it's actually quite exciting because it gives us the opportunity to date the walls and the silts themselves. Normally, we're relying on biological material, carbon, and that sort of thing, which you often don't get during constructional phases. So this was a really, really big asset. We await those dates very, very eagerly. Of course, the big sort of quirk of it is you have to sit under a tarp to do it, because otherwise you get a very, very modern date indeed. This was March, this dig, and it really was March during this dig. I think there's some pretty vile weather through the dig, and for anyone who's ever put back up a portaloo, it is a very unpleasant thing to do. So just a little thought to the practicalities of excavation as much as anything. That is the second DAT tent that we lost to this excavation, and we lost one at the third excavation as well. And they are incredibly robust, but this mountain most definitely conquered them. So here's Ford, again looking very smart in the middle, and here we have the diggers at the end of that dig. Thank you very much to everyone who helped there. We then had a decision to make, and that is, do you go back to the south gateway, look at where those deposits are really rich, where they're deep, or do you follow it across into the northern fort and try and understand that chronology we tried to address at the beginning? My red circle indicates that we went back to the south, and that's for a good reason, is that as archaeologists, we're not actually studying hill forts. Archaeology is the study of people, it is not the study of hill forts. In a sense, we can accept that people build hill forts in the Iron Age and that people rebuild hill forts in the Iron Age. And our questions have moved on to how do people use hill forts, why do people use hill forts, and what were their function to those people. So at the South Gateway, we knew that those deposits were really rich, and the decision was to go back, in a sense, to extend our last trench into that really rich hut platform just beyond the one that we'd looked at last time, with 3 finds from it, with the idea that we were going to be on something good. I know that doesn't quite line up, but it gives an illustration. So this is the trench, nice big open trench, which is exactly what archaeologists like. You can actually see our trial trench going through the middle of it in a bit of a wonky angle, as it were. And when we opened this trench, it was one of the first times we realised just how dense the hill fort was being occupied. In fact, there's another one here, and there's another one directly beneath it. We have, of course, excavated the one directly beneath that, and there's another 5 immediately surrounding it. So immediately thinking back to that photograph, we need to populate this fort an awful lot more. The first thing we came across was a really nice metalled surface. There's basically a pummeled-in stone surface made of small stones, repaired again and again. They don't photograph particularly well, I'm sorry to say. They look really nice in plan, but we haven't quite got there yet. But that has the occupation gunk that we very much like as archaeologists. Once you've looked at it, you take it off, of course. This was in baking weather, and everyone did extremely well to take it off. It was, in some places, of 20 or 30 centimetres thick, just hard, compacted stone. When we did get it off, we got some very nice... I still can't get this laser thing working. I see it on the wall over there, and then bring it anyway. We start to then see the structural features. Again, understanding how these hut platforms and the wider fort was used is exactly what we're trying to understand. I'll just run, this is it, slightly oblique, and this hut platform, is worth saying, was much bigger than the one beneath. We wonder whether the one beneath had actually been truncated for that reason. This seems to be really quite a large structure, whatever it is. We had all of the things you might expect, really nice post holes. These are the packing stones you see upright. This is the same one in different phases of its excavation. This one had been rebuilt halfway through, so this bit at the top here, that's an early post hole. It's then refilled again, so that's probably how it would have looked when it was being used. The big stones obviously were wedged in to keep it upright. These were quite deep, these post holes. Again, it was a Westphalian hill, and there's a reason why we've got secure footings. It was actually a bit wetter in the Iron Age, to put it in perspective. You will notice that you can't see much of a round house or anything like that in that. These big holes are all post holes pretty much. And actually, I think by the end of the excavation, we were preferring an interpretation where rather than a hut on a platform, this is a hut platform, i.e. it's sort of an integrated structure, as it were, using that bedrock scarp behind it as the back wall of it. So rather than that sort of traditional Iron Age structure that you're all imagining, something slightly more sort of embedded into the hillside. Again, a very good structure for the conditions they're living in. We had a lot of drainage going on. Again, it's West Wales on a hill, as it were. One that goes all the way around the outside, very nice as well, and then a sort of trapezoidal one just on the side, which probably replaced it later on in its life. You should also notice that there's a little trench on the right-hand side. That was a Fordian intervention as well, that we didn't know was there in the first place. That drain turned into a stone-lined drain above and actually sort of went around the one beneath it. And we also had the sort of general debris that you would expect from this kind of general occupation stuff. This is the little finger trenches that go off the bottom, looking at that lower one. This was just to establish whether it was a hut platform or not. We established that it is, as it were, but we didn't go any further than that. OLS dating came back. Very helpful again. It was a gale in this particular example. I think the people under the tarp were happier than the people over the tarp, as it were. And you can see there at the end of the excavation that we had basically completely emptied that hut, which is a really nice place to be. My final thanks to the volunteers and the staff. Becca there on the right-hand side is going to tell you a little bit more in a second. But I've just realised Toby's drawing is not in here for the second time, which is supposed to be, but there we go. But just to think about how we would change that drawing we saw right at the beginning. We would probably change the entrance, we'd probably make it bigger, more impressive. As I said, we would see banks of houses, almost a beehive across that, certainly the southeastern part of the fort, and that road spanning either way and turning into the fort, being shown those banks of houses. This is something about power, it's about, cultivating a great sense of, what a fort is on your way in, as it were. So yeah, my final thanks to the volunteers, Ken, of course, who was the project lead on the entire project, and Becca, because who you're going to hear from now. So what's next? Well, environmental sampling is still to come. They're off in the labs at the moment being looked at, and the scientific analysis that comes with that. Carbon-14 dating will be a big part of putting it back together, as well as that OLS dating. We will then report, I hope, in the coming years, and hopefully reconstruct. In fact, that's ongoing at the moment. The publication will be two parts. Hopefully there'll be a public document and sort of an academic document. I know the public document is already started. And we've been back this winter doing geophysical and topographical survey. The final thing, of course, is the community work, which I'll hand over to Becca now to tell you a little bit about.